was a quiet night just like many others. I was on duty, and the reports from the night didn't suggest anything out of the ordinary. But then, around 10:30 p.m., I got a call on the radio. A car had been abandoned on the most isolated road in the area, the infamous Route 17, known to some locals as the Disappearances Road. Of course, most people thought it was just folklore. But that night, I would learn that some legends run much deeper than. I arrived at the scene and immediately felt a chill down my spine. It wasn't just the weather. There was something in the air, a tension I couldn't explain. The car was there, parked on the shoulder with the doors closed. It was a black sedan, with no visible signs of damage or mechanical issues. It didn't make sense. Why would someone leave the car like that in the middle of nowhere? I parked my patrol car behind the vehicle and grabbed my flashlight. As I approached, everything seemed normal, but there was a growing sense that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you? That's exactly what I felt as I walked toward the car. The sound of the road was, when I paused for a moment, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I heard something. A faint rustling sound, far away, like someone moving in the vegetation along the road. My heart raced. I grabbed the radio to report the vehicle to the station, but the radio was dead. No signal. I began to wonder if there was something more. Then, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. In the corner of the mirror, reflected, there was a faint light like a flashlight, but it wasn't mine, and there were no other vehicles on the road. What was emitting that light? I turned around and saw nothing, but when I looked back at the mirror, the light was still there, blinking softly as if it was watching me too. It was at that moment I realized this wasn't going to be just another routine night patrol. Something was off about that road, and I was about to find out what it was. That light in the rearview mirror, it was making me uneasy. I knew something wasn't right. I looked back again, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, but again, nothing, just emptiness, the deserted road, and the motionless trees, as if time had stopped. But every time I glanced back at the mirror, there it was. The light, now closer, pulsing as if it was calling to me. It didn't make sense. Who or what could be out there? I decided to step out of the patrol car and head toward the source. But as soon as I shut the door, the car radio came to life for a brief second, static cutting through the silence. I turned quickly, expecting some sound or sign, but it was just the same static, followed by the same oppressive silence as before, as if someone or something had interfered, even if just for a moment. I kept walking. Each step seemed to echo along the deserted road. The rustling I'd heard before was louder now, almost like heavy breathing. I approached the bushes near the shoulder, sweeping the path with my flashlight. My eyes were fixed on the ground, looking for footprints or signs of movement. That's when I saw it. Between the leaves and branches, a faint reflection made me stop. I angled the flashlight down, and there it was. A pair of eyes, red and elongated, staring at me. My feet froze in place. It wasn't any normal animal. Those eyes were way too high up to be something small, maybe about 6 feet off the ground, fixed on me like it was studying me. I wanted to react, grab my weapon, do anything, but my body just wouldn't move. A chill ran up my spine as those eyes stared, unmoving. After what felt like an eternity, they shifted, slowly, to the side, disappearing into the trees with a soft rustling, like it was part of the night. I didn't know what to do. What had I just seen? I grabbed the radio again, trying to call for backup, but nothing, just static. My fingers trembled as I tried, unsuccessfully, to adjust the radio. The relentless static seemed to mock me. Every second on that deserted road felt like it stretched, as if time itself was trapped in some strange, endless loop. Then, in the dead silence, I heard a sound, footsteps. They weren't mine, quick and soft like someone was running. I turned immediately, sweeping the darkness with my flashlight, but there was no one, just the impenetrable blackness of the trees and the sound of my own limits. I knew I wasn't alone. You can feel that. My first instinct was to get back to the car and drive away, But before I could take the first step, a voice echoed in my head. Low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Help! Please! I froze in place. The voice didn't come from anywhere I could see. It wasn't from someone nearby. It was like it was inside my mind, echoing in my thoughts. I instinctively turned toward the abandoned car, and then I saw it. Across the road, almost blending into the darkness, a man was slowly approaching. He was staggering, like he was injured. His clothes were dirty, torn, but his face, something about his face was wrong. The features were strange, as if they were distorted by the shadows around him. His eyes were locked on me, empty, expressionless. Help? He repeated, but his lips didn't move. The voice wasn't coming from that body. I didn't know what to do. My instinct as an officer told me to help, but something much deeper, something primal, screamed at me to leave immediately. Every fiber of my being knew that this wasn't human. At least not anymore. As he got closer, I realized the abandoned car might not have been just a vehicle left on the road. Maybe it was a warning. I took a step back, keeping the flashlight steady on the man in front of me. Every part of me wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the ground. He kept shuffling toward me, his glazed eyes fixed on me, and that voice, that damn voice repeating, emotionless, "Help! Please!" I knew I should act, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. I grabbed the radio again, desperate, trying anything, but once again only static. The feeling of being trapped in a nightmare, where every attempt to reach the real world was blocked, began to consume me. Then, in a sudden impulse, I turned my back on him and ran toward the abandoned car. I needed to check something, anything that might give me answers. Maybe there were clues there, something that would explain who he was, or what he was. As I approached the car, I noticed the windows were fogged up from the inside, as if someone had been in there recently. My hand shook as I opened the door, expecting the worst. But the interior was empty, almost. There was something on the passenger seat, a leather-bound notebook. I carefully picked it up and opened it. The pages were scribbled with disordered writing, almost illegible. It looked like a diary, but the words were scattered incoherently, except for one phrase repeated over and over. "He won't let anyone leave." My heart raced. Who wouldn't let them leave? Who was he? And then, as if time had twisted once again, a loud noise echoed through the silence. A rustling in the trees, like something much larger and faster was moving violently among the shadows. I looked back at the man who had asked me for help, but he was gone. In his place, only darkness, and the sound of something approaching, something much bigger than him. It was in that moment I realized, whatever was on this road, whatever I had stumbled upon, this wasn't just a simple disappearance. It wasn't something that could be explained. It was a trap, and I had just walked right into it. The sound grew louder, fast. Each second pounded in my chest like a drum. I could barely breathe. I knew something was coming, something that shouldn't be there. The wind started to howl through the trees, and the rustling grew closer, as if the very darkness was moving toward me. I ran to the abandoned car, my sweaty hands fumbling to open the door again, but it seemed jammed, as if something unseen was holding it shut. I turned around, scanning the road with the flashlight, but there was nothing in sight, just emptiness, and that noise, growing, surrounding me on all sides. It was like the very air was thick with expectation, waiting for something I couldn't yet understand. I remembered the diary, those chilling words that sent shivers down my spine. He won't let anyone leave. Who was he? And why was he so sure no one would leave that place alive? The noise stopped, suddenly. The wind died down. Everything went silent once again. A silence that hurt my ears, as if the world itself was holding its breath with me. Then I felt it. I didn't hear it. I felt a presence right behind me. That overwhelming sensation that something was watching me. Something larger, something wrong. I turned slowly, my muscles locked in fear. There, at the edge of the trees, between the shadows, he stood. A tall, towering figure with those same red eyes I had seen before. They glowed in the darkness, fixed on me. His outline was indistinct, as if the very darkness was part of him. He didn't move, he just watched me. Every part of me screamed to run, to dash back to the patrol car and speed down the road, but my feet were glued to the ground. He had me in that moment of pure terror. Then he took a step forward. He made no sound, didn't disturb the leaves around him. He just moved, and in that instant, I knew. It didn't matter how hard I tried. There was no way out. Whatever that thing was, it had been hunting me from the moment I stepped onto that road. My instincts finally took over and I ran. I ran like I'd never run before. The sound of my heartbeat was deafening. When I reached the patrol car, I didn't bother opening the door carefully. I jumped in and started the engine with trembling hands. As I sped down the deserted road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The red light, those eyes were still watching me, following my every move. I never went back to that road again. And to this day, when I drive at night, I can't help but check the mirror, fearing I'll see those eyes again, waiting for me. Because I know whatever was on that road, it hasn't given up. And maybe one day it will find me again. It was a quiet afternoon when the call came in. We received a strange, even confusing, report about lights spotted in a town that had been abandoned for decades. Windfall, a place few remembered and almost no one ever visited. To be honest, it was the kind of assignment no one wanted. A ghost town wasn't exactly the type of place where a cop felt useful. But something about the tone of the report bothered me. It wasn't just about the lights. There was something more, something the report couldn't explain. It didn't mention who had made the report, just referred to unconfirmed sources. No one knew who had seen the lights or who had passed along this information. Myself and 2 other officers were assigned to check out the area. It didn't seem like much, just a routine check. Mysterious lights? Probably teens messing around, or at most, some old power lines that hadn't been decommissioned properly. The drive to Windfall was long and desolate, surrounded by forests and abandoned fields. As we got closer to the town, the sky began to change. Heavy clouds covered the sun, and a cold wind started to blow, as if nature itself was warning us to turn back. I remember looking at the other 2 officers in the car, both as quiet as I was, as if they shared the same unease. We finally arrived at what was left of Windfall. It was nothing more than a collection of old, crumbling buildings. Wooden houses falling apart, broken roofs, and streets that hadn't seen human life in a long time. The town looked frozen in time, as if it had been abandoned suddenly, with only dust and silence as its inhabitants. We parked the car in what seemed to be the old town center. I got out of the vehicle and immediately felt a chill run down my spine. An absolute silence, the kind of silence you don't find in nature. No birds, no wind, just emptiness. I approached one of the houses with my gun holstered and flashlight in hand, even though there was still some daylight left. The wooden floor creaked under my feet. The windows were all broken or covered in dust, and the air had a strange smell, like something old and damp had been rotting here for a long time. These lights, I thought, who the hell would see lights here, and why? As we investigated, I noticed something strange. There were no signs of life, no signs that anyone had been in Windfall for decades. But then, for a brief second, I swear I saw a faint glow coming from one of the houses further down the street. I called the others. Something was definitely off. I motioned to the other 2 officers, directing them toward the house where I had seen the glow. "Did you see the lights?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. They looked in the same direction, but the light was gone. It seemed like I was the only one who had seen it. That house, it was in terrible shape like the rest of the town, but something about it bothered me. It looked more recent somehow. Even with the worn wood and the partially collapsed roof, there was something about it that felt more alive. The window was broken, and I could have sworn there was something moving inside. A shadow. Maybe it was just my imagination, but suddenly I felt a sharp, biting cold that made me shiver. We decided to go check it out. As we approached, my footsteps echoed on the dirt road, as if the entire town was listening to our every move. A deeper silence seemed to surround us, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. The door to the house was partially open, creaking in the wind, as if inviting us inside. When we stepped inside the house, the smell of mold and rotting would envelop us. The natural light from outside barely filtered through the dusty windows, and I had to turn on my flashlight. The beam of light danced across the cracked walls and debris-covered floor. Suddenly, there was a sound, something soft, almost imperceptible. Footsteps? I looked at my partners, and one of them nodded, as if they had heard it too. We stood still, trying to listen again, and there it was, faint but undeniable. It was coming from upstairs. Without saying a word, we headed up the stairs, each step creaking like a muffled scream. I was in the lead, and the weight of the darkness seemed to grow heavier with every step. We reached the second floor, which was just as deteriorated as the rest of the house, but the footsteps were clearer now. It was like someone was walking slowly, one step at a time, aware that we were there but not wanting to be seen. The hallway ahead of us was completely dark, and my flashlight flickered for a second, almost going out. At the end of the hall, there was a door slightly ajar. My heart was racing. This wasn't fear like I'd felt before. It was something deeper, almost primal. Then, at the far end of the hallway, the door creaked open a little more. Something or someone was watching us from inside that room. The partially open door swayed slightly, as if someone was right behind it, waiting. My eyes were fixed on that dark space, trying to make out what was hidden there. I knew something was there. The feeling was overwhelming, but I couldn't see it. "You're seeing this, right?" I murmured to one of my colleagues, who stood just behind me. He nodded but said nothing. The third officer, however, seemed to hesitate. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and he stared at the door as if something was holding his feet to the ground. I couldn't just stand there. I raised my flashlight, one hand on my gun, and slowly walked toward the door. With every step, the sound of my own footsteps seemed to become more muffled, as if the environment was closing in around me. When I got just a few feet away from the door, I stopped. The silence was so thick I could barely breathe. And then, something moved inside the room. A soft sound, barely noticeable but very close. I knew someone, or something, was in there. With a trembling hand, I nudged the door open with the tip of my flashlight. The creak of the wood echoed down the hallway, and the door fully opened, revealing the dark interior of the room. I swept the beam of light across the room, and that's when I realized it wasn't empty. In the far corner, something crouched on the floor. It wasn't a person, not in the way you'd expect. It was a hunched figure, with a strange, distorted silhouette, almost fused with the shadows. The eyes were the only thing visible, reflecting the light from my flashlight back at me, glowing in a disturbingly unnatural way. Every instinct in me screamed to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. The air around me felt frozen as that thing slowly began to move, rising up, its joints cracking in a way that no human should. It moved erratically, as if it wasn't used to its own body or was struggling against itself. Then the voice began, a voice that didn't come from the figure, but from the room itself, as if the walls were whispering. "He doesn't like intruders." The phrase hung in the air, chilling me to the bone. My partners seemed frozen in place as well, but something deep inside me, some primal survival instinct, forced me to back up. I knew we had to get out of there, but before I could say anything, the figure moved fully. Its eyes locked on mine and started coming toward us. That thing moved toward us, slow but determined. Its eyes didn't blink, and every step seemed to echo strangely, as if the sound itself was distorted. I instinctively backed up, pulling one of my partners with me. My entire body was on high alert, but it was as if the atmosphere around us was suffocating, preventing me from thinking clearly. My partner closest to me, the one who had been hesitant from the start, mumbled something like, This can't be real. He was pale, his eyes wide, unable to look away from the approaching figure. He wasn't prepared for this. None of us were. I knew standing still wasn't an option. We're getting out of here. Now. My words came out fast, almost choked. There was no time for hesitation. The figure was just a few feet away, its body twisting unnaturally, as if made of something that shouldn't be able to move like that. We ran. We bolted out of the room, down the stairs to the ground floor. The sound of our feet pounding on the steps seemed louder than normal, as if the air itself was amplifying the noise, making it clear we were trying to escape. The third officer, the one who had hesitated upstairs, was now in full panic. I could hear his heavy, almost frantic breathing behind me. As we entered the main room of the house, that oppressive feeling didn't lift. If anything, it felt like the entire town was watching us, as if the shadows of the abandoned houses were shifting. Then I saw it. Through the broken window out in the street was a figure similar to the one we had seen in the room. No, several figures. They were there, standing, watching. This isn't happening. I heard my partner whisper, almost in shock, but I knew we couldn't stop. We couldn't stay there. Let's go, I said, my voice rough. Now. We rushed toward the front door, the feeling of being watched never leaving us. It was like the entire town was alive, but not in a way I could comprehend. The shadows moved around us, and those narrow eyes we had seen upstairs now seemed to follow us from every corner. The pressure in my chest grew, as if the air itself was being sucked out of the town, leaving me breathless. When we finally burst out of the house and jumped into the patrol car, the sense of escape was immediate, but incomplete. We knew we were still being watched. I could feel it. Whatever it was out there watching us. I fumbled to start the car. My hands were shaking. The key turned and the engine roared to life. But before speeding away, I glanced one last time in the rearview mirror. At the far end of the street, the figures were still there, now motionless. And behind us, the house we had just left, with its dark windows like hollow eyes, seemed satisfied. The feeling that we were only just beginning to understand what was happening in Windfall would stay with me for a long time. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring as we sped away from the town. The car raced down the road, but the sense of relief which would normally come with distance just didn't exist. The silence in the car was heavy. My partners were quiet, their eyes fixed on the road, but I knew none of us really believed we had escaped. As we drove, something strange started to happen. The lights in the patrol car began to flicker, the radio crackled with static, and suddenly the road ahead seemed different. It was the same road we had driven in on, the only way out of Windfall, but now it felt longer, more twisted, like we were never really leaving the town. One of my partners finally broke the silence. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice low, almost trembling. "We should have been out of here by now." And he was right. We had been driving long enough to have left Windfall behind, but the trees and asphalt just kept repeating, as if we were trapped. I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a dark shape, standing on the road behind us. But when I blinked, it was gone. My heart raced. Sweat trickled down my forehead, despite the cold air coming through the window. Something wasn't right. "Are we going in circles?" I muttered, more to myself than to the others. There was no answer. It was as if no one wanted to admit what we were all starting to realize. The road was pulling us back. The patrol car's radio crackled again, this time louder. The static turned into a distorted sound. And then, a low voice, almost a whisper, came through the speakers. "You shouldn't have come." We all heard it. I looked at the officer next to me, his eyes wide, mouth slightly open, unable to say anything. The voice repeated once more, "You shouldn't have come." And then the radio fell silent again. That's when I understood. Windfall wasn't going to let us leave. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated something ahead. It was the same entry point where we had first parked the patrol car when we arrived in town. The same intersections we should have left behind. But there it was, as if we'd never left. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. Whatever that town was, it wasn't just a normal place. and no matter how hard we tried to escape, we were trapped in its cycle. I can't explain this," one of my colleagues muttered, his eyes locked on the darkness in front of us. "This is impossible." Without thinking, I opened the door and stepped out. I needed air, needed to wrap my head around what was happening. My feet hit the asphalt, the sound echoing again in the unsettling silence. I stood there, breathing deeply, trying to make sense of something that couldn't be explained. But there was no logic. I knew that now. Windfall wasn't just a ghost town. It was a trap. That's when I felt it again. The sensation of being watched, but this time, not from behind. This time from above. Slowly, I lifted my gaze to the sky, and what I saw froze my blood. Up there, hovering in the shadows of the clouds, were lights. The same lights that had drawn us here. They flickered softly, moving in strange patterns, as if they were watching us. I could barely breathe as the lights descended slowly, coming closer to the town, to the car, to us. It was as if they had found us. And in that moment, I truly understood. It wasn't just the figures in the shadows, or the shapes in the houses. Windfall was alive, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for us from the very beginning. The lights drew nearer, and the only thing I knew for certain was that I was no longer alone. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. I knew the road by heart, an area on the edge of town, where the most you'd find were a bit of local history and the occasional wild animal or, at worst, lost campers. But that night, I received a different kind of call. Strange lights, they said. Something out of the ordinary in the forest area everyone called forbidden. Of course, most people thought it was just folklore, old stories grandmothers told to scare the kids. I'd never paid much attention, until that night. I arrived at the location around 10:30 p.m. The wind was blowing cold and steady, making the trees sway in a way that caused the shadows to look like they were moving on their own. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car, illuminating the path ahead. The dirt road split into a trail leading into the heart of the forest. This was the part people avoided. They said things disappeared here, and it wasn't just people. I walked a few steps, the branches crunching beneath my feet, when something made me stop. Symbols, marked on the trees, carved like scars. I'd never seen anything like them before. Circles, geometric shapes, some I couldn't even identify. But what caught my attention most was that they weren't old. They looked fresh, as if someone had been through here recently, marking their territory. As I moved deeper, that damp, strange smell grew stronger. It was like wet earth mixed with something else. Something sour, like rusted metal. Suddenly, I heard rustling in the leaves to my left. I stopped, aiming my flashlight in the direction of the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. But the feeling of being watched was undeniable. My senses were on high alert. I kept following the trail, knowing I had to check out the source of those lights. But with each step, the forest seemed denser, more closed in, like it was pushing me away. When I finally reached a small clearing, something ahead made my heart stop for a second. In the center of the clearing, in a perfect circle of old stones, there was a cabin, completely out of place, like it didn't belong in this world. The wood looked old, but it was untouched, as if time hadn't been able to touch it. What disturbed me the most, though, was that right above the door of the cabin, the same symbol carved into the trees was etched there. But this time it seemed to glow faintly, like it was pulsing with some energy I couldn't understand. I knew I shouldn't go inside, but something in that darkness called to me. My grip tightened on the flashlight, but my heart was pounding. I knew that cabin shouldn't be there, so isolated in the middle of a forest where almost no one ventured. Every fiber of my being told me to turn back, to leave, but something pulled me closer, as if the forest itself was holding my legs, dragging me toward that door. I took a few steps closer to the cabin, the flashlight cutting through the path ahead of me. The sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot felt muffled, like the very air was being held in. That's when I realized the forest was completely silent. No wind, no rustling of the trees, not even the distant cry of an animal. Just my breathing and the sound of my steps. When I got closer to the cabin, I saw the door was slightly ajar. The same symbol I'd seen on the trees was carved above it, and that faint, pulsing glow still emanated from it. Felt alive, almost like it was breathing. The metallic smell I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, saturating the air around me. Then, without warning, I heard a sound, coming from inside the cabin. It was like a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. The voice was low, like the wind passing through narrow cracks, but there was no wind. I stepped closer, my flashlight flickering in the darkness. The whisper grew louder, and for a moment, I had the impression it wasn't a single voice. It was several. Without thinking, I placed my hand on the door and pushed. The creak of the wood echoed through the clearing, shattering the eerie silence. The darkness inside the cabin was thick, like it was swallowing the light from my flashlight. As I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, denser, as if something invisible was pressing down on me. I swept the beam of light across the room, and what I saw made me freeze. The cabin was filled with old objects, covered in dust, as if it had been abandoned for decades. But in the center of the floor, drawn in some kind of ash or charcoal, was the same symbol. Only this time it was much larger. And in the middle of it, something was laid on the ground. A piece of old leather, like a book, covered in inscriptions I couldn't recognize. Then the voice returned, stronger this time. But now it came from outside. I turned slowly and saw, in the distance, between the trees, a figure. It wasn't large, nor particularly threatening, but it was there, motionless, watching me. It was draped in a dark cloak, and even from afar, I could feel its eyes fixed on me. I wasn't alone in that forest. My blood ran cold as I realized the figure standing between the trees. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. The beam of my flashlight barely illuminated its silhouette, but I could feel the weight of its gaze. It was as if the forest itself was breathing with it, as if it was part of the landscape, something much older than I could understand. My hands shook, but I knew I had to get out of there. Every second seemed to stretch time, like the air around me was getting heavier. But instead of retreating, something, maybe curiosity or pure survival instinct, pushed me to take a closer look at the figure. With the flashlight in hand, I took a step out of the cabin, keeping my eyes fixed on the silhouette. Suddenly, it moved, a slow, deliberate step, not toward me, but around the clearing, like it was circling me. The sound of its feet on the ground was almost imperceptible, as if it was floating. The figure walked with an eerie lightness, and every time it moved, I felt a growing chill down my spine. I couldn't make out its face. It was hidden beneath a dark hood, but I knew it wasn't taking its eyes off me. Then, the voice returned, not from inside the cabin, but from the cloaked figure. Low, distorted, mixing with the wind that now whispered through the trees. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was clear. A warning. I should have left right then, should have run. But there was something about that figure, something that held me in place. It was pulling me deeper into the unknown, further away from reason. And then, with another smooth motion, it raised its arm, pointing towards something to my right, beyond the cabin, into the heart of the forest. I followed the gesture with my eyes, and that's when I saw it. A faint, bluish-green glow pulsing between the trees. The lights, the same lights that had brought me here. They weren't far, but just enough to make me question what lay ahead. The figure, still motionless, kept pointing, as if guiding me. My mind was at war. Stay and face the unknown, or follow where that thing was leading me. Somehow, I knew there was no right choice. Everything had been wrong since the moment I stepped into that forest. But even so, something compelled me to move forward. I took one step, then another, approaching the clearing where the lights pulsed between the trees. It was then that I heard a sound behind me, a sharp crack, like someone or something was right there, Close. My body froze for an instant. I turned slowly, and what I saw made my heart race. The hooded figure was gone, but in its place was a new presence. Much larger, much more threatening. The Guardian. As I turned, I felt the air around me change completely. The presence now occupying the space where the hooded figure had been was different. Huge. Heavy. I could feel the weight of its gaze, even though I couldn't fully see what stood before me. My flashlight shook in my hands as I tried to focus on the shape towering between the trees. It wasn't a normal creature, and it didn't seem human either. Its outline was vague, as if shrouded in a mist that moved with it. But what paralyzed me the most was the overwhelming sense of power that radiated from its presence. The figure, no, the Guardian, took a step forward. Its movement was slow, almost deliberate, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight. There was no sound but the faint rustling of leaves and my unsteady breathing. The blue-green lights that had been flickering in the distance now seemed to dance around it, as if they were alive, responding to its presence. In that moment, I knew this creature was the Guardian of the forest, the protector of something far older and far more dangerous than I could comprehend. It wasn't just a physical guardian. There was an energy, something almost mystical, that surrounded it, something that kept the forest isolated from the rest of the world. My feet were glued to the ground. Every ounce of courage I had mustered up until this point vanished. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the forest, now alive around the Guardian, was holding me there, forcing me to stay. The Guardian took another step. By now, I could feel its heavy breath, like wind crawling through the forest, and the energy emanating from its presence pressed the air around me. There was no doubt it knew I was there. It didn't move like a predator, but like something that knew it didn't need to chase, something that knew it was already in control. At that moment, a voice echoed in my head. It wasn't an external sound, nor a suggestion like before. It was a mental presence, almost a thought that wasn't my own. "You don't belong here." The words were firm, final, like a last warning. The feeling of being judged by something far greater than myself overwhelmed me. Finally, my survival instinct took over. Without thinking, I took a step back, and then another. My hands still held the trembling flashlight. The Guardian didn't advance any further, but its oppressive presence made it clear I had crossed a line. With my heart pounding in my chest, I slowly turned and ran back toward the trail, leaving the cabin, the lights, and the Guardian behind. Each step seemed faster, more urgent. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if it was still watching or following me. But I knew, deep in every fiber of my being, that it would let me go. Because in that moment, the Guardian didn't see me as a threat. I was just someone who had gone too far. And I knew, for sure, that no one entered the forbidden forest and came out unscathed. As I ran along the trail, the sound of my footsteps on the ground seemed muffled, as if the forest was trying to silence my escape. The thick, oppressive air pressed against my lungs, but I didn't stop, couldn't. The feeling of being watched, of something or someone following me, kept me on edge. Every shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to move, as if the very environment was alive, conspiring to keep me there. Finally, I reached the clearing where my patrol car was parked. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't dare pause. I ran to the car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I jumped in and slammed the door, feeling the cold metal against my back as I tried to steady myself. I turned the ignition with trembling fingers, the familiar sound of the engine giving me a brief moment of comfort. But that relief was short-lived. As I glanced into the rearview mirror, my heart dropped again. There it was, the Guardian, not in the clearing, but at the edge of the forest between the trees. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, too pale, intense lights fixed on me. It didn't move, but its presence was impossible to ignore. It was as if it was warning me. I could leave, but I would never forget what I had seen. And worse, I knew that something much larger was at play. Something I wasn't supposed to have discovered. The voice came back into my head, clearer this time, as if the forest itself was speaking to me through the Guardian. Don't return. The warning was clear. There was no room for doubt. I had been allowed to leave, but I wouldn't get a second chance. I shifted the car into gear and sped down the dirt road without looking back. The engine roared as I left the forest behind, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade. Even as the trees thinned and the road opened up, that presence still lingered over me. As I finally saw the city lights on the horizon, a brief wave of relief washed over me, but the darkness I had left behind felt like it was still clinging to me. Even though I was far from the forest, something inside me had changed. I knew, with an unsettling certainty, that what I had witnessed that night wasn't meant for human eyes. The Guardian had allowed me to leave alive, but what I carried with me was the weight of an ancient secret, something the people of the town had only ever whispered about. The Forbidden Forest held far more than simple folklore. When I reached the city, I parked the patrol car and shut off the engine. I sat for a moment trying to calm my racing heart. The distant sounds of nightlife felt almost comforting after what I had just experienced. But when I closed my eyes for a second, the pale glow of the Guardian's eyes was still there, burned into my mind. I knew this wouldn't be the last time I thought about the forest. And worse, I knew that, at some point, something or someone might pull me back to that place. Because no matter how far I tried to distance myself, something had marked me now. The Guardian doesn't forget.